Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Elijah Magnier returns to the show. He's currently in Beirut on his way to Damascus. We talk about Trump's announcement of a rapid withdrawal from Syria, the prospect of a Turkish invasion of Kurdish and US-occupied areas in Syria, and the situation this creates for the Kurds who, even if Trump reneges on his order, are now confronted with a crisis of confidence in long-term American occupation. We also discuss Russia's consequential change in the rules of engagement with Israel and Syria, and a possible Middle East summit. Elijah is a veteran war correspondent, a terrorism, counterterrorism analyst, specializing in Europe and the Middle East, especially Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, and Libya. Follow Elijah on Twitter at EJMALRAI. Find his work at ejmagnier.com. We recorded this interview today on December 20th, 2018. Hello, Elijah. Welcome to Around the Empire. It's great to talk to you again. How are you doing?
Hello, Joanne. Thank you for having me again. I'm great. Thank you.
Where are you today? You said that you just traveled this morning, right?
Yes, I've landed in Beirut and I'm traveling to Damascus in a few hours, following the latest development just to see how the government of Damascus will react, how they are going to deal with the Kurds, and how they receive the information coming from Trump, the unexpected information, and if he's going to maintain his word and won't change his mind again.
Yeah, that's what we're all wondering, whether he'll change his mind or whether he'll be, I don't know, what you say, coerced to changing his mind. He definitely seems to have been, have caught everyone by surprise here. And of course, it's now 5 days from Christmas and, you know, everybody's heading out of town in D.C. in terms of Congress. I would guess that the people in the Pentagon and things like this live in the area anyway, but so they're not heading out of town. But, you know, it's a time when the government is getting ready to go a bit dormant for a while. So that his timing was pretty interesting too. I think he has pretty much caught everyone by surprise. Is that also true in the Middle East and Europe? And do you know of anyone who saw this coming?
Well, we heard the Israelis saying that they learned about Trump's intention to announce his withdrawal from Syria earlier on. The British and the French said more or less the same. And within the U.S. establishment, I mean, Trump can't take this decision alone without consulting, particularly because he's not very expert in what's happening in foreign policy, and particularly what's happening in the Middle East. Therefore, I don't think this is a unilateral decision of Trump just waking up in the morning and say, hey, today I'm going to pull out of Syria. I think it is a wise decision because the Americans are no longer safe in Syria. They're no longer doing the job that they were supposed to do, as they claim to come and fight the Islamic State, ISIL, because the Islamic State has been stagnating in Al-Hasaka Deir Zur province for the last few years, particularly under the US protection or mood to hit them whenever they want to hit them and to keep a small force whenever they want to. And we see today, Trump said just not long ago that there are 30,000 ISIS still in Syria and Iraq. And yesterday he said there are no more ISIS. So I think it's the US intention to leave some forces of ISIS in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq and Syria, which is fine because the Iraqis and the Syrians prove they are capable of destroying ISIS and eliminating ISIS militants, not the ideology, but the control of territory and to hunt them down.
Right. Now, I remember it was at least a year ago. It might have been closer to 2 years ago. I started this podcast 2 years ago this month. So it was probably, let's say, a year and a half. I remember you telling me that eventually the American troops and our allies would have to leave the east, east of the Euphrates, whatever territory had been conquered at that point. We didn't know how much territory it would be. You had told me that it was not possible for them to stay indefinitely in the long term because an insurgency would turn up against them. They're surrounded by unfriendly forces, except you could argue the Turks, ally to the north. But I remember at that time, wondering how things would work out. So this is not a surprise to you, I suspect.
No, actually, it is not a surprise because first of all, the U.S. forces in Syria came just to try to do something and to have a base in Syria and to make sure that the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, can eventually link to the Iraqi Kurds. And then they create Rojava, and then they create the Kurdistan, and all this area will link together with which is an area rich of oil and gas in both countries, Syria and Iraq. And also, it's a free base where they have constructed several airports and they have constructed several bases. The problem with that is I know of many members of Hezbollah and IRGC I've met in Syria who serve in Al-Hasaka, and they are there with the small Syrian force that never left Al-Hasaka, and the Kurds are aware of their presence, and they are in very good contact with the Arab tribes in the area, and their intention is to make sure that the Americans are not going to have an easy life in Syria if they decide to occupy the country for very long. Now, that's one point. The second point is Al-Tanaf is a desert. It's an area, it's a crossing area that I've done tens of times between 2003 and 2007 before I start taking the flight from Beirut or Damascus, traveling to Iraq or somewhere else when Iraq, before Iraq didn't have any functioning airport. So I used to cross the borders from through Tanaf by car, and it's a completely isolated area for miles and miles. There's nobody on the side of the road, just a few sporadic houses and farmers just before Tanaf and a little bit after. And therefore, it's an area where the Americans have gathered also tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. They can't bring the supply without a coordination between Jordan, the Syrian government, the Russian, and they are financing the supply of foods and the logistics to the refugee that goes completely against Trump's ideology of gathering money rather than spending money without any return. And also, these 55 kilometers around the Tanaf are today completely surrounded by Hashd al-Sha'bi, particularly when the previous Iraqi Prime Minister Haider Abadi was no longer elected and failed to be re-elected. And the new Prime Minister, Adel Abdel Mahdi, is determined to see all the Hashd al-Sha'bi along the borders, because this is where mainly the forces of ISIS are crossing, but not exclusively, because there are some sleeping cells in the country. However, that was the main source of concern to the Iraqi government, and we saw in many occasions the Iraqis Air Force bombing ISIS in Syria in an area under the U.S. control when it is the U.S. who's supposed to do this job. The U.S. and the coalition, the British, the French, and everybody who's still there. So it is really weird to see the Iraqis coming from Iraq to bomb in Syria in an area under the U.S. control with the U.S. coordination and to bomb ISIS there when they are just a few miles away from the U.S. Special Forces. So all that doesn't make sense. And also because the U.S. presence in Syria is built under the pretext of fighting terrorism. Now, Trump is not fighting terrorism, is fighting terrorism occasionally, depending on his mood. And when the military want to fight ISIS, they are protecting terrorism because they're protecting Al-Qaeda in Idlib under another pretext of chemical attack or chemical bombs. So basically, it's a whole mess of the presence of the U.S. there. It is illegal. It's not under the request of the Syrian government. It's a presence very close to another superpower, Russia, where they rub against each other in a couple of occasions, and they were very close to a real catastrophe, particularly when the Russian contractors early this year in February tried to cross the Euphrates along with other Syrian forces to attack ISIS, and where they were completely wiped out by the US forces, who find the energy to attack the Russian and the Syrian while they try to attack ISIS, but don't find enough energy to attack ISIS in the area where they control. So all that just can't go on forever. Now, Trump has managed to divert the attention from the Khashoggi case. He attracted the world attention to his intention to pull out from Syria. We haven't seen yet a serious pull-out of forces. I mean, asking the State Department to leave and keeping thousands of special forces and troops on the ground, it is not a withdrawal. We need to see that happening. And he said between 60 to 100 days, anything can happen between 60 and 100 days. I would like to see it first.
Right. Yeah. So the orders, for people who haven't read it, there was an order for State Department, any diplomats in the area, to evacuate within 24 hours. Now, I also heard, and this is just on Twitter, so not confirmed, just that some of the Kurds had reported that the French forces were leaving alongside the Americans, because the question was, well, yeah, Trump can pull the American troops out, but what about the British and the French who are also there with them? So I did hear one report that some French were leaving along with American troops. Did you hear anything like that?
Well, I can tell you that the French and the British will never stay 1 minute extra alone without the Americans. If the Americans are leaving and the coalition, they are there under the request of the Americans, they will not stay because they will be an extremely easy target. Everybody would want to kick them out.
I also heard that some of the French and British said, well, that the coalition, without the American troops there, are the backbone of the coalition. So either the French and the British rely on the infrastructure that the Americans provide. So that makes sense. But I mean, you mentioned the Khashoggi affair. I mean, this is clearly related to it. It seems like Erdogan playing his cards very shrewdly with his, dripping information out, and, with a lot of coordination here by a certain faction of our government and our war party, and the media just really piling on. And I just always thought, though, that the the actual murder of Khashoggi um, was certainly being used as a strategy because the Saudis had done things like that so many times in the past. The reaction this time was so different, and so you could say, all right, well, it's just we finally said, enough is enough, and we're going to back away from this alliance with the Saudis. Of course, we also know that there are factions, which Saudi royals, our intelligence agencies, let's say, prefer, and some they don't, and they really don't like MBS. But I have to say, I was very surprised at the way Erdogan played this, and I'm just surprised at the results he got from it. I mean, this is a major win for him. The economic war against him was definitely ramped down. When the Khashoggi murder happened, he was in serious trouble. Their economy was under pressure. Certainly their currency was under pressure. That seems to have calmed down a lot. And his position in Idlib, he was under pressure, to carry out what he had promised in Idlib. He couldn't do it by the deadline. He was given more time. And of course, the situation with Syria. It appears that he talked to Trump on Friday and told him we're going to invade Syria. We will not tolerate the Kurdish forces, becoming more and more organized and better armed on our border, and we're going to invade. Oh, and I guess the one other piece of leverage he used was he said that we're going to buy the Russian S-400 missile defense system. And it seems like Trump just caved. Now, Trump, all right, the one thing I think he is telling the truth about is that he always did want to withdraw from Syria. He didn't want to keep troops there. If we're to believe what he's been saying for at least 2 years, he did want to pull out. He publicly announced it before, and he had to walk that back when his own advisors and military generals basically said no. But this time, he's not listening to any of them. And he's announcing the withdrawal and giving the orders on his own.
Well, Trump really, the base in Syria is no use for the American. It's not essential for the American. The Americans will love to be present in every single country. That's their nature, the nature of the belligerent spirit of the American establishment. Nevertheless, the Americans have a presence in Israel. They have a presence in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Iraq, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia. They are everywhere. To remain in a hostile environment in Syria is not an add value. It won't change a lot for them, particularly if they become under attack. And that will look very bad on Trump. He doesn't want that. Now, Turkey is not going to look good if Trump pulls out and the government forces of Damascus move in al-Hasaka. That will stop his plans to occupy part of Syria. And I really believe when the Americans pull out, that Idlib will be next on the list of targets, because the fake warning of chemical bombs will go away with the American withdrawal, and the Al-Qaeda will have no more any superpower protecting it in Syria. And on the first occasion when they violate the agreement with Turkey, then the Syrian and the Russian will not forgive them. Now, so far, Erdogan has been given a lot of possibilities to extend the deal over Idlib, regardless the violation of the deal from Jabhat al-Nusra or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or whatever, from the jihadists, let's call them, is much better. Because it is convenient for the Syrian and for the Russian not to give the Americans any reason to bomb the Syrian army and to destroy its military infrastructure. Therefore, they've been very patiently waiting for an opportunity to move on Idlib or to keep the status quo and leave Idlib as it is for the jihadist and the Turkish forces to struggle among themselves. And any violation, as we saw recently last month in Aleppo, when the jihadists bombed Aleppo, so the Russians really burned the ground under their feet. So Russia is not using soft gloves with the jihadists every time they try to violate the agreement established between Turkey and Russia and Iran. With the pullout of the Americans, I think Turkey is not going to be in a good position. Turkey will have to start thinking about its own withdrawal. They have to push toward the political reconciliation because the tens of thousands of militants and jihadists under its control, we're talking about Hamza Brigade, about all the other groups that are under Turkey operating, including Jaish al-Islam, that used to be pro-Saudi, now it is working under Turkey, and without counting the Sultan Murad and all the other. So all these, they have to go somewhere. And Turkey is not going to open its arm and say, yes, come to Turkey and join the army. They have to be integrated within the Syrian army, or they have to find a solution for these, to find a way to dissolve within the Syrian institutions, because the war is ending. There's no point, there are no strategies anymore. There are no objectives, there are no purposes, and nobody can change anything. We saw President Omar Bashir coming to Syria just a few days before Trump's announcement of his intention to withdraw. So the Saudi Arabia and the Emirate and the GCC countries were aware of such a decision, and they want to embrace Assad back to the Arab League. So everybody is saying, okay, we've learned the lesson. There's no more regime change. There's no more possibility for us to create a failed state in Syria and to allow jihadists to create a chaos in the country and just to create a big Middle Eastern area full of struggle, using the sectarian religious aspect, and all of that is over. And it is time to say, okay, it is finished. And I think this is what Trump has reached today.
Yeah, so Asani broke the news some weeks ago that the Emiratis had decided on détente with Syria, with Assad. So what I had heard was that it really wasn't just the Emiratis, that also the Saudis were on board with that. And so that's what you were just talking about, that they had come to the conclusion that the regime change operation was over. And do you think that played a role in Trump's decision?
I think that is a decision that has been taken throughout the year of 2018. It's a long, slow process, but I think it was digested by the Saudi and the Emiratis, and they understood that the Americans are no longer willing to stay in Syria and fight on behalf of the Arabs and do their own war just because there is a hate from Saudi Arabia toward Iran, and the enemy is Iran regardless. And they are happy to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to keep that mantra ongoing. But the Saudis and the Emiratis understand today that they can never be friends with Bashar al-Assad and with Syria, but they don't need to be in love with each other. They just need to do business, and they need to start again and look after their own interest. Now, Syria needs a lot of reconstruction. And if Saudi Arabia and the Emirates move into Syria to reconstruct the country, they will have their share and they will have their piece and they will have a bit of influence, but they will not enjoy a special relationship as they used to before 2011. So, yes, the area of the Middle East is going toward a large reconciliation and the end of the war, and Iran will remain the only enemy that everybody likes to attack and consider that, okay, we have a target and the target is Iran. So the Americans need to continue selling weapons to Saudi Arabia so they can defend themselves against Iran, a country that never attacked Saudi Arabia face to face, is always through proxies on both sides.
So as far as the thing that made Trump move right now, why he chose to do this when he did it, do you think that Erdogan really is poised to invade Syria? Or do you think that Erdogan gave Trump a reason to do this?
I think Erdogan pushed to move into Manbij, and he really desperately wanted to do that, even at the cost of clashing with the American will that was resisting and trying to convince Erdogan not to move into Manbij. So I think the Americans, in my point of view, have considered that sooner or later they're going to leave, and if Turkey moves into Al-Hasaka province, then the Kurds will be exterminated. And when I say the Kurds, I say the Kurds of Al-Hasaka that consider themselves part of the YPG or PKK, Syrian branch of the PKK. And if they are exterminated, then Trump will look really, really bad. I mean, he would look responsible for the possible genocide against the Kurds in Syria. And this is something that he wouldn't like to have on his career, particularly as he's aiming for a second term. So instead of allowing Turkey to move in, to look weak in front of Turkey or to clash against a NATO member. So I think Trump took the less problematic decision and the less painful, which is to pull out. And by pulling out, if he pulls out, so far he just said he will pull out. So if he pulls out, then I don't think Turkey will move in, because the Syrian army will not allow it to do so unless the Americans stay. And if they don't stay, then the Syrian army will move in and Turkey will not be allowed to move in, because here the balancing point and the balancing country is Russia. Because of the good relationship between Russia, Iran, and Turkey, because they have major interest in keeping this link, because they have very high commercial deals at stake. They have energy deals that are much more important than a piece of territory in Syria. I think Turkey will refrain from occupying Al-Hasaka, and I think sooner or later Turkey will pull out. So if we look at Turkey in Iraq, they have excellent relationship with the Iraqis, but they still occupy a small piece of territory in Kurdistan. And Iraq continue asking the Turks to pull out. I think this is the same thing, the same scenario is going to happen in Syria, because the Turk will resist as much as possible not to pull out from the area under their control, but sooner or later they will have to leave Syria.
So I tend to agree with you on that. I don't think Erdogan's going to move his troops across, but, from day one, what Erdogan said that he wanted was a buffer zone all along the border, all the way, from beginning to end, from the Mediterranean all the way to the border with Iraq. And I forget how, it may be a 20-kilometer buffer zone or something like that, between the Turks and the Syrian Kurds on the other side in one area, and well, just all across. So, as far as I know, Erdogan has never backed down on that demand of having this buffer zone area. I personally never understood why, if he wants a buffer zone, why doesn't he create one inside Turkey? He can have a buffer zone if he wants, but he insisted on making that territory part of, the Syrian territory. And he, as you said, there are these fighters in Idlib that are a problem for him. He doesn't want them coming back to Turkey, causing trouble there. So, what about the idea that Erdogan struck some kind of a deal to take just a slice of territory all along the border and populate that with his fighters from Idlib? Is that a possibility?
Um, I think the buffer zone, everybody asked for a buffer zone at the beginning of the war between 2011 and 2013, up to 2015. The Israelis wanted a buffer zone in the south, and Turkey wanted the buffer zone in the north. The Kurds wanted an independent federation, and everybody was trying to take a piece of a very weak and non-united Syria. With the arrival of Iran and Hezbollah in 2013, and the air support of Russia in 2015, the language changed, and the will of a buffer zone became a bit softer. When the Americans arrived to Al-Hasaka and start saying, we are here to stay, and they start building their airport, then again, Erdogan wanted his buffer zone, because during the battles of Syria, we have to remember that it was thanks to Erdogan that also Aleppo fell back to the control of the Syrian army, because he asked 3,000 of his people, of Sultan Murad and Nuruddin Zinki, to pull out, and Ahrar al-Sham, and they pulled out before the battle. It is also Erdogan played a role in Ghouta, did not protest or contested the attack against Ghouta, and allow Russia and Syria to take it without creating a storm around it. So, yes, at a certain point, many people wanted a buffer zone. Today, Erdogan doesn't speak about the buffer zone. He speaks about the security of Turkey. He speaks about preventing the YPG and the PKK, the Syrian branch of the PKK, to create a zone that can be a platform to attack Turkey. So he's using a completely different language. He's calling upon Turkey's national security, the protection of the national security of Turkey. So I don't think the buffer zone is a sellable idea anymore, particularly with the Americans saying they want to withdraw. And even if they don't withdraw, it's like they have, because now the Kurds know that the Americans are untrustworthy. They will not stay there forever and protect them. And Turkey knows that the Americans can pull out from one day to another, and Syria will want to recover the territory, particularly Al-Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor, where there are oil and gas, and Russia is supporting that. So the buffer zone is démodé, it's finished. No more buffer zone.
So Turkey holds some territory along the border, Jarablus and some other towns, and it doesn't look like, I've seen pictures of schools and administrative buildings where there's all Turkish flags and Turkish pictures on the wall, and they look like they're there to stay. So do you think that they will be convinced that they'll need to leave those towns too, the ones they already have?
Yeah, they use the Turkish currency. They have Turkish flag. They have Turkish number plate. They teach the language. They use the currency. They consider it part of Turkey, a temporary part of Turkey, because situation evolved and changed, and because the Americans are no longer staying there. Turkey will look like a sore thumb in Syria, and the Russian, slowly but surely, along with the Syrian, will put pressure on Turkey to pull out. At the end of the day, Turkey is investing in Syria, is investing in the area of Idlib, in Afrin. They have to give back the people their land. They can't deny the land on the Kurds, and they can't prevent the Kurds from returning to Afrin, because this is a card the Syrian government will use, because the Syrian government, I expect, is going to embrace the Kurds and will say, okay, you've been doing what you've been doing. You've been used by the Americans. You allow yourself to be used by the Americans. You even accepted to lose Afrin for not allowing the Syrian army to move in, because the Kurds wanted the Syrian army only along the border to prevent Turkey from moving in, but without any interference in the local administration. And there's a lot of money in the Afrin enclave. So that didn't go, and the consequences is disastrous on the Kurds, and they turn out to be the biggest losers in Syria. Now, it is time to bring them back, and it is time to use the Kurds in the area where they are as a force to protect the borders, because at the end of the day, the Kurds know their area and they can protect the border and their area and the province from ISIS, because ISIS is still around, is not vanishing completely. And the Kurds will be also a useful leverage for Damascus to be used against Turkey and ask Turkey to pull out. And I think with the withdrawal of the Americans, that would be great. And that was the priority for the Russian, for the Iranian, for Damascus, to see first the Americans out, because they are the greatest danger. Once the Americans are out, then it will only be Turkey to put pressure on, and that will be much easier, even if it's not straightforward, but it will be the only problem the government needs to deal with to free the entire Syrian territory. And then, in the meantime, without stopping, they will reconstruct the country, and they are trying to attract different countries willing to invest in Syria to reconstruct it.
I mean, that seems like the only option now for the Kurds. And what Erdogan has effectively done is pushed the Kurds back into the arms of the Syrian government to reconcile with. They were never entirely, I mean, they always had an open line of communication. True, and my understanding is that the Russians always wanted to bring the Kurds to the table, the negotiating table, to work out some kind of an agreement. Now, the question would be, right now the Kurds are in a lot of territories where that wasn't originally majority Kurdish areas, like in Deir ez-Zor and such. And also, they've got military bases that the Americans have built, and they're also heavily armed and well trained. And I believe they want to police their own territory. So I would think that would be the sticking point. But I mean, even if we completely withdraw from Syria, the Kurds still have something to bargain with. They're holding territory, and they are armed. True. So do you think that's how this will play out? Where, the Kurds use the land and the fact that they are well armed as their bargaining chip at the table?
No, the Kurds said we no longer want the federation. We want a kind of autonomy in our enclave, and we want to be part of the Syrian government. And that was in the latest negotiation a few months ago with Damascus. But then everything stopped because the Syrian government used a harsh word with the Kurds and said, you have to stop protecting the Americans and you have to move away from the Americans. So the Americans know they no longer have a Syrian individual protecting them. So this is what the Kurds hesitated to do, and they struggle among themselves because there were currents, political currents inside among the Kurds who approved the full reintegration within the Syrian government, and others who kept saying the Americans will stay here forever and will not leave. Now, I don't think the Kurds can do that alone. Their weapons, I think, will be used within the framework of a force that is part of the Syrian army and not an armed body away from the Syrian army. I think I can share this with you. I think the Syrian government will no longer have many militia as they have today once the war is over and once Idlib is liberated and Al-Hasaka is liberated. So they will integrate almost everybody within various military and security structure within the Ministry of Defense and the Interior Ministry, exactly what like Iraq, when they have integrated Hashd al-Sha'bi within the federal police and the army and kept also a separate body, but all that under the umbrella of the Ministry of Defense. So therefore, the Syria will do the same, will not accept a separate Kurds armed body on their own, but they will be integrated within the army, and they will have a kind of particular status because they know the land and they can protect it, and they can look after Syria. But I am almost certain that Damascus will ask the Kurds to pay a heavy price for their loyalty to the Americans and not to the Syrian government.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So it all comes down to the decision that the Kurds will make. But it still remains, will Turkey be satisfied with that? They'll still have a Kurdish military force on the other side of the border, and it just seems to me that they'll have the same gripe that they always had. Are you saying that Erdogan will trust the Syrian government to bring the Kurds into the fold and to not be aggressive toward Turkey? Or I still don't see how this gets reconciled, the problem between the Kurds and the Turks.
Well, Erdogan will not have a say on the Syrian government. The Syrian government will control the Syrian territory without asking the opinion of Erdogan. And they are the best. And I think Erdogan trusts the Syrian government more than trusting the Americans on the Kurds affairs, because they both, Erdogan and Assad, had the same objective, which is to see the withdrawal of the American forces and to prevent the Kurds from having an independent state or federation. And they both worked on the same objective, and they were in harmony. Now, if the Americans pull out, this objective has been reached. Now Damascus will turn to Erdogan and say, it's time for you to leave. So they will not give the possibility for Erdogan to have a say on the Kurds, because the Syrian government will not accept to see the Kurds with an independent entity and creating a possible danger on its neighbor, that is Turkey. So Assad will be the best protector of the Turkish-Syrian borders.
So Assad's military, it seems like they're going to have to scramble now to take control of the strategic resources like the dam, like the oil fields and all of that. Do they have, I thought that he'd been reducing the size of his military. and he has Idlib to deal with. Do they have enough forces to move in and stabilize or keep stable, the Manbij area all along the Euphrates and the territory east of the Euphrates? I mean, do they have the capability to do that?
Well, the last time I looked at some figures, I learned that there are between 175 to 190,000 members of the Syrian army. The Syrian army has been rebuilt with all the side forces and militia and national defense forces, etc. They have an army now. And as we know, there is no need to bring tens of thousands of soldiers to protect every province. That this is not the way countries and government protect their country. They bring small forces, and when there is a need, they bring a large force to deal with the problem, depending on the size of the problem. So yes, I think Syria has liberated the south, the middle, the north, and there is only Idlib and the Al-Hasaka area where it is occupied by a few thousand people and no more. The biggest part of Syria is under the Syrian government control, and the biggest part of the army is present now in Aleppo and around Idlib and around Deir ez-Zor and Al-Hasaka. So they really don't need many forces in the country when there is a stability.
And now we've been talking about the Kurds, but supposedly, according to our military, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, is a majority now Arab fighters. So what happens to those fighters who were allied with SDF? Are they hostile to the Syrian government completely? I mean, or will they just agree to ally themselves with the Syrian military now?
But this is that choice to be integrated within the army or to do other jobs. They will be integrated. That was part of the negotiation held in Damascus a few months ago between the Kurds and representative of the Syrian government. And they said those who want to join the army are free to do so. And those who choose to do other jobs, they're free to leave.
Right. So the question is, are they going to fight the Syrians when they try to assume control of that area again? It probably wouldn't be too smart to do it.
The Kurds expressed their will to fight with the Syrian army against the jihadists in Idlib. And they told the representative of the Syrian army that we are ready to provide you with several thousands of fighters and to attack Idlib whenever you decide, as part of the Syrian army umbrella. No, the Kurds were the Kurds have never left the negotiation or the link with the Syrian government. It was up and down, but there's never been a clear cut between the Kurds and the central government.
Well, that's interesting. We don't hear about that here, Elijah. The commotion yesterday was, and the fear was that the Turks are going to invade and slaughter the Kurds, and that, we didn't hear anything about any alliance with the Syrian government and the Syrian military.
Well, look, if you look throughout the years, the Kurds helped the cities of Fuaq, Freya. They helped the cities that were the Syrian cities that were surrounded by jihadists, and they supplied them with food, and they fought along the Syrian army in many areas in Aleppo, because there are Kurds in Aleppo, and they were always never against the Syrian army. There were two incidents. Once it has started in Al-Hasaka many years ago, when they attacked the Syrian army and pushed the Syrian army outside many offices in the city to a military barrack at the outskirts of Al-Hasaka. And that was fine because the Syrian army receive the supply in that area from Turkey, and the borders between Syria and Turkey through Al-Hasaka are open, and we don't hear about it in the media because people rarely are allowed to go in that area and to investigate that aspect. And secondly, there were individual clashes between Kurds and the Syrian army, the Kurds attacking convoy the Syrian army. So as far as I remember, there were only 2 occasions. If you look at these 7 years of war, we can see that the Kurds supported the Syrians and the Syrian army much more than clashed with them. Therefore, we can't say the Kurds are the enemy of the central government or is not cooperating with the central government. The Kurds never cut the relationship with the Syrian government, always supported the Syrian army, supported the isolated Syrian cities, but also made themselves as a shield to the Americans. And that was not tolerated by the Syrian government.
Now, how about Israel and the Saudis? How do you think that they agree with Trump's decision to pull out of Syria?
Well, I think the Saudis don't have a say because the Saudis are coming closer to Assad. We don't hear Adil Jubeir saying Assad must leave by military or diplomatic means since quite a while. And the Americans, I think they've reached a conclusion that they can take and get whatever they want from the Saudis and not necessarily from Mohammed bin Salman. So MBS is dispensable. Therefore, any person who will rule Saudi Arabia will have to establish a good relationship with the Americans and buy off the Americans what the Americans would like him to buy. I think there is a possibility I've heard about to save Mohammed bin Salman is to create a kind of a Camp David in the US and bring Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman together for a peace process, more or less like Anwar Sadat or Arafat. Therefore, that is a possibility. I don't know how much MBS is willing to go through it and to digest it, and how he is going to look in the Middle East. Although we can see that the Israelis and the Saudis are traveling between the 2 countries, the Israeli airline El Al is flying above Saudi Arabia. There are visits of Saudi responsible to Israel and vice versa. And there are Israelis in all over the Middle East, like in the Emirates, in Bahrain, in Oman, and in Qatar. We don't see it in Kuwait, and we certainly don't see it in Iran, and we won't see it in Syria or Lebanon. Therefore, I think the Israelis can rely on the American infrastructure that is existing and established in the Middle Eastern countries now that the relationship between Israel and the GCC is at a very good level. And I don't think Saudi Arabia can say anything because Trump asked them to finance some aspect of the US presence in Al-Hasaka and a bit of Raqqa, but not enough money was poured into that area. And we see Raqqa is not rebuilt and is still completely destroyed by the Americans and not reconstructed. So if the Americans want to stay and occupy a part of Syria, as any occupation force, they have to invest, they have to reconstruct. This is not, Trump doesn't want to do that. And the Israelis enjoyed the military airport in Syria under the control of the Americans. They've used that military airport in Al-Hasaka when they bombed Hajj al-Sha'bi command and control base on the borders, when they bombed the T4 Iranian military base close to Palmyra, And they have used it few times in the last year. But I mean, there are other ways to do it, and the presence of the Americans in Al-Hasaka is not that indispensable for the Americans to ask the opinion of the Israelis if they stay or not, or the Saudis. Certainly not the Saudis. The Saudis don't have an opinion, they just execute.
Hmm. Yeah, that's something we don't hear about here either. The Israeli use of the American bases in the Kurdish held areas. Now, you wrote an article about the Russian rules of engagement changing. What kind of a role does that play in this whole? Well, first of all, if you wouldn't mind just explaining what that change was and tell us if it factors into this whole situation.
That's an interesting question. The Russians are giving a very hard time to the Israelis, and everything has started with the Russians, really. When the Russians came to Syria in 2015, September 2015, they said to the Israelis, to the Syrians, to the Iranians, and to Hezbollah, we're not part of your struggle. You can do whatever you want among yourselves. That doesn't concern us, as long as Israel doesn't bomb combat units that are fighting on the ground, taking advantage of the Russian air bombing. And Israel abided by this, the Russian will, and the Israelis have accepted not to bomb Hezbollah and Iran throughout the years, until 2018, when the Iranian sent a drone into Israel, and then this is when they shot down the Israeli jet F-16 over the Golan Heights. This is where the equation started to change. Now, the response of the Israelis was destroying every single warehouse, military warehouse, that belonged to the Syrian army, under the excuse of bombing Iranian warehouses. And that was not true. They were not Iranian warehouses. They were military warehouses belonging to the Syrian army, and not necessarily making missiles or advanced missiles. No, they've destroyed everything they put their hand on, and they have created a bank of objectives, and they crippled the Syrian army. So the Russians saw that the Israelis are not playing fair here, and the objectives destroyed are not part of the threat that Israel considers to its national security, but is a kind of a revenge and taking advantage of the Russian neutral position, until the IL-20 was shot down. And this is when Russia said, enough is enough. Now, you can no longer fly over Syria without the permission, and I need to know in advance, and I approve or disapprove your bombing. And what they did, and this is something that haven't been told before, is the Russian put a flag, their flag, on every single Syrian warehouse, military warehouse, and military institution, to say to the Israeli that are taking photographs through their drones that this is a Russian controlled area. And like that, the Israelis can no longer bomb any objective with a Russian flag, and the Iranians resupplied the Syrian with all what they needed, with a better missile, more precise missile, and a lot of weapons and ammunition landed in Syria to refill the Syrian warehouses. And the Russians said to the Syrian, you are free to attack, to respond as a defensive measure to any Israeli attack without taking the initiative. So it is not up to Syria to start bombing Israel, but it is the right of Syria to return the fire by bombing an equivalent or the same objective that is bombed by the Israelis. So if Israel bomb the airport, the Damascus airport, and hit directly a military warehouse, then Syria will hit Tel Aviv airport or Ben Gurion, or will hit any other airport in Israel in exchange of the hit. So it will be a really tit for tat, and Syria will have a reactive bombing rather than taking the initiative to bomb. And that with the Russian blessing, and the Russian informed the Israelis that you have no longer a free playground in Syria, and any violation of the Syrian sovereignty by attacking Syria will be responded. This is where this is a new rule of engagement, and this is where Israel finds itself with the back against the wall, incapable of violating further the Syrian airspace. Now, there is a small detail I may add here, that there are information that Israel said to the Russians, if I cannot bomb Syria, then expect me to bomb Lebanon. And this is when the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, said to Israel, clearly, overtly over the television, if you think you can bomb Lebanon, we will retaliate. And he was very clear about it. And that message came immediately after the Israeli message to the Russian that they want to bomb Lebanon if they can't bomb in Syria. And now I don't think they can bomb in Lebanon.
Okay, so that's why the situation with Lebanon escalated.
Well, the situation in Lebanon escalated on the media side, no more. So we see Netanyahu trying to vent on the tunnels that, according to Ehud Barak, the ex-prime minister, that Israel knew about these tunnels 2 years ago and established ambushed on these tunnels. And Barak said, and I quote him, he doesn't understand why to bring the question of the tunnels now. What's the purpose? So the Lebanese tunnels, the Hezbollah tunnels between Lebanon and Israel, it's a common knowledge, and Hezbollah knew about it, and Hezbollah knew that the Israelis discovered it, and we can count 4 clear violations from Hezbollah against Israel in exchange of 1,800 violations this year of Israel against Lebanon.
That's very interesting. About the shooting down of the Russian plane, the story that we were told, do you believe that? Is there any more to it? I mean, there are rumors that it didn't happen the way we were told.
Well, the Israelis didn't give enough time for the Russian airplane to do its maneuver and land in Hmaimim. So actually what happened is the Israelis informed the Russians while they were flying already in the air and going toward Syria, and that takes you really a few minutes. The IL-20 Russian communication plane was above Syria, and as soon as the command was informed, they informed all the aircraft to land to avoid any collateral damage. And while the airplane was doing a maneuver, the Israelis attacked. And when the Israelis attacked, the Syrian, as they know what is the procedure is when the Israelis attack, then they can launch any air defense system against the Israelis because all the Russian jets are on the ground. Well, it didn't happen this time, and the Syrian launched the air defense missiles, but the Russian didn't have the time to land because they were not informed by the Israelis, and the Israeli came from exactly the same direction, so that's above the Mediterranean, to attack Syrian objectives that made more or less that created the confusion and the Russian aircraft looked exactly like one of the Israeli jet attacking Syria and violating Syrian airspace and bombing Syria. So the Russian understood clearly what happened, and that was not the deal with the Israelis. The Israelis should have informed Russia way ahead, enough to create to ensure the safety of all the Russian crews, and that was what Russia reproached to itself by allowing the Israeli to do what they wanted and not to respect the deal from the first beginning to the end. And the cause is they've lost 15 highly trained officers, and that was the highest number they've lost and the most trained officers they've lost in Syria.
Yeah, and I imagine that plane was, very valuable equipment. But there was no involvement from the the French frigate that supposedly fired a missile around the same time or was in the area.
Oh, no, no, I don't think so. Otherwise, the French frigate would have received a Russian missile.
Mm. Yeah. So also the S-300s, the Russians allowed the Syrians to have some more serious missile defense now. And are those also considered, like the Russians, you say, put their flag on the Syrian warehouses? Are the new S-300s, first of all, are they active now? And did the Russians effectively put a Russian flag on those two to disallow any kind of Israeli attack on those missile defense batteries?
No, Russia did more than that. All the S-300 are operated by Russian officers to make sure that they know how to deal with targets. And Russian officers, this is something that is not widely known, have been in Syria since many years at the time of Hafiz Assad. And they were in Syrian base since many years, and they are today in many Syrian bases, and particularly with the S-300. And hitting an S-300 by Israel, even if it is under the Syrian control, which is not, it's like attacking Russia. And Syria and Israel understand what that means.
Yeah, so basically they're pretty well tied down now. They don't have a lot of options. Frankly, I've never thought that the American coalition, had many options in Syria either. I very much agree with withdrawing, but I guess the most important thing that you explained today was the situation with the Kurds, the panic that Turkey is now going to immediately move in and slaughter the Kurds seems much less likely to me based on what you've told me.
Well, now I think that the Turkey needs to think about the next move. It's not straightforward. It's no longer straightforward. Turkey can't speed up and then say, okay, the Americans are leaving, so I move in Manbij. I don't think so. Because if the Americans said, we are leaving, then they're not leaving, so they gain time to stop Turkey from moving into Manbij. And if the Americans are leaving, Turkey can't say, I'm going to occupy Manbij before the arrival of the Syrian troop. It doesn't make sense because Russia will not accept and will say, you have to pull out. And then if there is a coverage of the Syrian territory, it means Turkey cannot fly above Syria without being confronted with the Russian Air Force, which is a confrontation that Turkey and Russia and Syria and Iran don't want. Therefore, the biggest, I think Turkey is in the most weird position today because it has to think carefully about every single move from today onward. They can't move into Manbij while the Americans are there because the Americans saying, hey, wait, we are leaving. Allow us to leave. And when we pull out, that is known in the military academy, forces are vulnerable. So don't move in because we can't protect our forces while withdrawing. So stay where you are. And then they can't move in because the Syrian army is expected to move in if the Americans leave. If the Americans don't leave, there is no deal for Turkey to move in to Manbij now, so they have to wait between 60 to 100 days. So all that is creating a lot of havoc for Erdogan to think about carefully what is going to be the next move. But not only that, it was he's going to do with Idlib. Now he feels the heat under his feet because he knows once the Americans are out, if they leave, then there is no more the false flag of chemical bombs to protect Idlib.
So what's going to placate Erdogan? I think there's certainly more to this deal between Trump and Erdogan than we've been told. What does Turkey get out of this?
Out of what? Sorry?
What would satisfy if Trump and Erdogan made a deal? Yes. Presumably Trump is doing what Erdogan wanted him to do, to withdraw. So where's the upside for Turkey? What does Turkey get out of all of this that makes them happy?
Well, Trump is not getting Erdogan to withdraw. Trump is getting Erdogan not to move in and move forward and attack Manbij. But he's not getting Erdogan to move out Jarablus and Afrin and Idlib and the surrounding area. But he's freezing Erdogan. This is what Trump is getting by saying, I'm going to pull out. If it is a maneuver, it's a clever one. If it is serious, it's still putting Erdogan in trouble because he needs to think what to do next. Now, what Erdogan is going to do, I really don't know, but I think the only possibility for Erdogan is to stay where he is, protect the area where he is, and wait and try to get more political concessions for his people he is protecting in the north, and to re-establish good relationship with Damascus to find a way out. I think that is the only possibility because now it is time now for the economy to be boosted rather than to use the language of war between Turkey and Syria. The war is coming to an end. It's finished. There are two areas. There is Al-Hasaka province and there is Idlib. Al-Hasaka Kurds, ISIS and the Americans, and Idlib Afrin with Turkey. There are only two countries to deal with, and all the rest are details.
Right. In fact, that might be why the talk of Trump trying to find a way to extradite Gulen to pacify Erdogan, that might be why that has been coming up lately. That's a whole nother subject. I've kept you too long already. Elijah, I really appreciate it. Is there anything else that you want to say to our listeners before we wrap up?
I think if Trump is serious, this is a great day for Syria. If Trump is not serious, it is a great day for Syria because Syria will regain its integrity and will be under the control of the central government, whoever is going to lead this government. I am against regime change and against allowing creating a road for jihadists to rule a country. I am not with one person or one individual. It is not my country, but I think Syria has suffered enough, and it is time for Trump to leave and for Turkey to follow.
Agree. And let Syria work this out with their allies and former enemies. And hopefully that's what's going to start happening in these talks that are supposed to start in January. And again, I really appreciate it, Elijah, and be careful while you're over there. And thank you so much for sharing all of this information and insight with us. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening, and a special thanks to Elijah Magnier. Follow Elijah on Twitter at EJMAlrai, EJMALRAI. Find his work at ejmagnier.com. Support him by using the PayPal links at the bottom of every page on his website. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media, brought to you with the help of our donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or one-time donations on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. The syndicated audio podcast is the main focus of Around the Empire and where we have our most traffic. I'd like to add some video live stream content in the new year. Please help us do that by hitting the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. That's free, so that we can gather enough subscribers for revenue there. Also, use the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. Subscribe to the audio podcast on your preferred podcast app. We're on most, if not all of them: iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Music, Spotify, iHeart, Stitcher, and many more. If you like the podcast, take a minute to leave a nice review. It helps. See you next time. Take care, everyone.